When billionaire Christopher Aldridge ordered in French to humiliate his assistant at an exclusive Manhattan dinner, he had no idea she understood every word. What he dismissed as an uneducated idiot was actually a woman who'd spent 7 years in Geneva and was fluent in 3 languages. But Vanessa Hartford didn't react with anger. She responded with strategy. Over the next 3 years, she would transform from invisible furniture into the CEO of his company, using the very vulnerabilities he accidentally revealed during that insult. This is the story of how one moment of arrogance became a billionaire's downfall and an underestimated woman's ultimate vindication. Welcome to a story that proves intelligence and patience are more powerful than any title or fortune. Before we begin this journey of transformation from invisible assistant to powerful CEO, I want to share a blessing with you. May you always recognize your own worth, even when others fail to see it. May you have the wisdom to document your capabilities and the courage to seize opportunities when they arrive. And may you never underestimate the person standing quietly in the corner. They might be the architect of your future. If this story resonates with you, I'd be genuinely honored if you'd consider subscribing and hitting that like button. Your support helps share these stories of resilience and strategic brilliance with others who need to hear them. Now let's dive into Vanessa's remarkable journey. Apportez-moi quelque chose de décent. Aïe pas la piquette que cette idiote sans éducation boirait. The words fell across the private dining room of Le Bernardin like a silk scarf concealing a blade. Vanessa Hartford didn't flinch. She kept her pen moving across the contract annexure, her posture unchanged in the Eames chair positioned precisely 3 feet behind Christopher Aldridge's right shoulder. The chair itself had been selected for its transparency. Chrome and black leather that suggested she wasn't really there at all. Bring me something decent, not the swill this uneducated idiot would drink. The sommelier, a compact man with silver temples and the stillness of someone who'd spent 30 years watching the wealthy perform, allowed his eyes to flicker toward Vanessa for exactly 1/8 of a second. She caught it. A micro-expression of professional solidarity, perhaps even pity. He recovered immediately, nodding with practiced deference. Certainement, Monsieur Aldridge. Je suggère le Château Margaux 2010. Note de Cassis, tanin soyeux, finale persistante. Christopher waved his hand in that particular gesture the recently wealthy perfected. Imperial dismissal dressed as casual sophistication. Fine. Just make sure it's properly decanted. Last time the temperature was barbaric. The 3 men seated across from Christopher, 2 from Silver Lake Capital, 1 from Deutsche Bank's New York office, exchanged the kind of looks that men who'd attended Exeter and Princeton exchanged when new money tried too hard. Vanessa cataloged this. Everything was data. She'd been Christopher Aldridge's executive assistant for 14 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. Before that, she'd been a legal analyst at Kirkland & Ellis, pulling 70-hour weeks reviewing commercial real estate portfolios and cross-border acquisition agreements until her father's medical bills had mounted beyond what even big-law paralegal money could manage. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer didn't care about your LSAT scores or your cum laude from Georgetown. Christopher had found her through a headhunter who specialized in what the industry euphemistically called discrete support roles. Assistance for men who required intelligence but demanded invisibility. The salary was obscene, $420,000 annually, plus a discretionary bonus structure that had, last year, added another $180,000, enough to cover experimental treatments, enough to keep her father in a private suite at Sloan Kettering, enough to make her swallow things like this. As I was saying, Christopher continued, pivoting back to the term sheet spread before him. The liquidation preference structure is non-negotiable. We're talking about a 2.5x participating preferred with full ratchet anti-dilution protection. Your LPs want exposure to the PropTech disruption thesis. This is the entry point. Marcus, no, she caught herself. Gerald Feng from Silver Lake tapped his Mont Blanc against the bound presentation. The ratchet is aggressive, Christopher. If you miss the Series B milestones, we'd effectively own 60% of the company on a fully diluted basis. That's not partnership, that's a death spiral. That's accountability, Christopher corrected, his smile revealing teeth that had been veneered the previous summer in Switzerland. Vanessa had scheduled the appointment. She'd also seen the invoice, $43,000 for cosmetic dentistry. My team delivers. We've quintupled valuation in 18 months. This isn't some lifestyle business. We're building the infrastructure that'll make residential real estate function like a liquid security. The sommelier returned with the Bordeaux. He performed the ritual. Label presented. Cork drawn with a whisper of friction. The ceremonial taste pour into Christopher's Riedel stem. Christopher swirled, sniffed, sipped. He held the wine in his mouth for exactly 3 seconds. Vanessa had timed this particular affectation before, then swallowed. Acceptable. Poor for everyone. He glanced back at Vanessa without actually seeing her. Not for her. Water is sufficient. The sommelier poured. Vanessa watched the wine catch the light from the Murano chandelier above the table, crystal that probably predated the restaurant's 1986 opening. Each glass filled to the proper level, 1 inch below the widest point of the bowl. Gerald received his pour and nodded his thanks directly to the sommelier, making eye contact. Old money gesture. Christopher's father had owned a chain of regional tire franchises across Tennessee before Christopher had leveraged that into a private equity fund specializing in distressed retail, then pivoted to technology speculation. The pivots had been successful. The manners hadn't evolved to match. The carried interest split is also standard, Christopher pressed on. 20% carry to the GP, standard 2% management fee calculated on committed capital. Your funds deployed $3 billion across 17 deals this year. You understand the math. We understand extraction, the Deutsche Bank representative said. His name was Wilhelm Ostermann, and he'd spent the first 15 minutes of the meeting asking questions in German with Gerald, effectively excluding Christopher from the conversation until Christopher had grown visibly annoyed. Now, Wilhelm leaned back, his Brioni suit showing not a single wrinkle despite the 90-minute meeting. What we're evaluating is whether the underlying business model justifies the valuation. You're asking for a $450 million Series B on a company generating $17 million in revenue. That's a 26 multiple on sales, Christopher. Even in a frothy market, that requires religious faith. It requires vision, Christopher countered. He lifted his wine glass, examined it against the light as though he could actually detect notes of cassis from visual inspection alone. The platform is already processing $2.3 billion in annualized transaction volume. We're taking 28 basis points on every trade. Once we hit scale, and our growth rate is holding at 40% month over month, the unit economics become extremely compelling. If the growth rate holds, Gerald said quietly. We've seen the preliminary Q3 numbers, Christopher. You're starting to see compression in the cohort retention metrics. Customer acquisition costs are climbing, while lifetime value projections are softening. That's the beginning of a very familiar story. Vanessa watched Christopher's jaw tighten. She knew what was coming before he spoke, because she'd drafted the rebuttal memo he'd studied last night at 11:30, sitting in his Tribeca penthouse while his wife entertained her book club 2 floors below. The cohort analysis is being distorted by onboarding experiments we ran in August. We deliberately throttled the qualification algorithm to test conversion sensitivity. If you normalize for that, the retention curve is actually strengthening. Vanessa, the appendix. She rose without sound and stepped forward, placing the supplementary packet at Gerald's right hand. She'd printed 4 copies on 32-pound linen paper that morning, bound with Belgian linen covers, each page tabbed with color-coded indices that corresponded to the sections Gerald would want to cross-reference. Her fingers didn't touch his. She withdrew before he could acknowledge her. Page 17, Christopher said. Third-party validation from Cornerstone Analytics. They've modeled our retention against every comparable platform that's achieved unicorn status in the last 5 years. We're tracking above the 75th percentile. Wilhelm accepted his copy from Vanessa without glancing up. She noticed he was left-handed, adjusted the placement accordingly. Details. Always details. The conversation continued through the wine, through the first course of hamachi crudo that Vanessa watched arrive and be consumed while she maintained her position by the credenza, through the Dover sole that Christopher ordered for the table without asking preferences. She tracked the negotiation with the part of her attention that had been trained through 3 years of commercial litigation support, noting when Gerald's body language opened slightly at the mention of the strategic partnership with Zillow, cataloging the micro-expression of skepticism when Christopher described the proprietary machine learning algorithm. But another part of her attention, the part that had nothing to do with professional discipline, kept returning to those French words. Cet idiot sans éducation. This uneducated idiot. Christopher had selected French because he'd spent a summer in Paris during business school. He'd mentioned this precisely 11 times in Vanessa's tenure. He'd studied at INSEAD for 8 weeks, lived in the 6th arrondissement, developed what he believed was fluency. Vanessa had heard him conduct phone calls in French with potential European investors. His accent was functional, his vocabulary sufficient for business negotiations, his grammar occasionally tortured but generally comprehensible. What Christopher didn't know, what he'd never thought to discover because executive assistants were furniture and furniture didn't have biographies, was that Vanessa Hartford had spent 7 years of her childhood in Geneva. Her mother had worked for the World Health Organization, a logistics coordinator position that had relocated the family when Vanessa was 6. She'd attended the international school, become fluent in French and conversational in German and Italian, spent her afternoons reading Flaubert and Camus for pleasure, while other children watched cartoons. She'd returned to the United States at 13 when her mother's position had been eliminated during a funding restructure. She'd lost the accent through years of American public school, where being the girl who'd lived in Switzerland made you interesting for approximately 1 week before it made you pretentious. She'd learned to flatten her vowels, to say like as punctuation, to hide anything that made her different. But the French had remained, living in a quiet corner of her mind like a room in her childhood home she rarely visited, but could still navigate in the dark. Cet idiot sans éducation. The insult was almost quaint in its directness. Christopher had been showing off, demonstrating sophistication to men who'd actually attended international boarding schools, who'd spent gap years in Provence, who spoke 4 languages because their families had owned properties across 3 continents for generations. He'd been performing cosmopolitanism, and he'd used Vanessa as the punchline. The sommelier reappeared as the entrees were cleared. Digestive, gentlemen? Armagnac, Christopher said immediately. The 76, if you have it. Regrettably, monsieur, our oldest Armagnac is the 1989 Chateau de l'Aubade. That'll do. Christopher glanced at his watch, a Patek Philippe Nautilus in rose gold that Vanessa had picked up from the boutique after its 6-month service last Tuesday. We should wrap the business discussion. Vanessa, pull up the board composition proposal on the screen. She moved to the media console built into the ebony paneling. The screen descended silently from the ceiling, saw 110 inches of OLED display that cost more than most people's cars. She connected her tablet, pulled up the presentation deck she'd formatted the night before. The first slide appeared. A pristine organizational chart showing proposed board seats, voting rights, observer positions. We're proposing a 7-member board post-financing, Christopher began. 3 seats to the founders, myself and the 2 technical co-founders. 2 seats to the new investors, split between Silver Lake and Deutsche, and 2 independent directors will mutually agree upon. The founder seats have weighted voting rights. 10 votes per share on governance matters, 1 vote per share on economic matters. This is standard founder protection. It's standard founder entrenchment, Wilhelm corrected. Sue, you're asking us to write a check for $200 million while maintaining absolute operational control regardless of performance. What happens when you miss milestones? What happens if the growth story falls apart and we need to bring in professional management? That's what the milestone triggers are for, Christopher said smoothly. If we fail to hit the agreed KPIs for 2 consecutive quarters, the voting rights normalize to 1 per share. You'd have the ability to outvote us on any major decisions. That's meaningful downside protection. Gerald was studying the screen, his expression unreadable. What constitutes a major decision? Standard stuff. Selling the company, raising new capital, hiring or firing C-level executives, taking on debt above $10 million. It's all spelled out in the draft certificate of incorporation. Compensation changes? For officers, yes. For employees, no. We need to maintain flexibility on talent retention. Vanessa watched the negotiation continue, her role reduced to slide advancement. Click. The next chart appeared, showing the waterfall distribution if the company sold for various multiples of the investment. Click. A competitor analysis positioning Christopher's platform against established players. Click. A timeline for hitting profitability, with revenue and burn rate projections extending 42 months into the future. The Armagnac arrived in Riedel brandy balloons. Christopher swirled his glass and inhaled with exaggerated appreciation. Remarkable. You can taste the oak aging. Wilhelm sipped his in silence. Gerald didn't touch his at all. I'll be direct, Christopher, Gerald finally said. The deal you're describing is structured for a company that's already proven product-market fit. What you've proven is that you can spend venture capital efficiently on customer acquisition. That's not the same thing. We'd be comfortable participating in a Series B at this valuation if the governance terms were more balanced. As structured, we'd be passive capital in a vehicle entirely controlled by management. That's not our mandate. Christopher's smile didn't waver, but Vanessa saw his left hand tighten on his knee beneath the table. I'm disappointed to hear that, Gerald. I thought Silver Lake had the appetite for backing transformational companies at the inflection point. Maybe we've been talking to the wrong fund. Perhaps. Gerald stood, buttoning his suit jacket with the economy of motion that suggested bespoke tailoring, so precise the garment moved as an extension of his body. We appreciate your time. If you're willing to revisit the control provisions, we'd be happy to continue discussions. But at these terms, we'll have to pass. Wilhelm rose as well. I concur with Gerald's assessment. The business is interesting, Christopher. The deal structure is not. Thank you for dinner. They departed with handshakes that conveyed polite disinterest. The sommelier materialized to clear their abandoned digestives. Christopher sat alone at the table, his face now showing the fury he'd suppressed during the negotiation. Get the car, he said to Vanessa without looking at her. She sent the text to his driver. They kept Dimitri on standby during all dinner meetings and began collecting the presentation materials. Christopher drained his Armagnac in a single swallow, poured himself Gerald's untouched glass, drank that too. Fucking old money cowards, he muttered, sitting on their inherited piles, too scared to back real innovation. They'll regret this when we're worth $5 billion. Vanessa said nothing. She slid the contracts into her leather portfolio, powered down the display, ensured no proprietary materials were left on the table. Christopher stood abruptly. What's the next meeting? Tomorrow at 9, conference call with the Sequoia partners. 3 p.m. You're presenting at the Morgan Stanley Technology Summit. Evening is blocked for the Alzheimer's Benefit Gala at Cipriani. Cancel Sequoia. Move it to next week. I need to work on the pitch. Clearly something isn't landing. He walked toward the exit, then paused. That French sommelier was competent. Make a note to ask for him next time. Of course. They walked through the restaurant, past tables where other negotiations were unfolding, other performances of wealth and power. Outside, the October air had turned cold, the kind of sharp autumn chill that came early to Manhattan when the wind pushed down from Canada. Dmitri waited with the Maybach, engine running, door already open. Christopher climbed into the back seat. Vanessa moved to follow, her usual position during car rides, silent presence ready to pull up documents or draft emails on demand. But Christopher held up his hand. I'll ride alone. Take an Uber. Be in the office by 7 tomorrow. I want the Sequoia deck completely rebuilt before the afternoon presentation. The door closed. The Maybach pulled into traffic, disappearing toward Tribeca. Vanessa stood on West 51st Street, her portfolio under her arm, and felt the words again. Cet idiot sans éducation. She pulled out her phone and opened Uber, but her thumb hovered over the screen without tapping. Around her, the city performed its evening ritual. Taxis hunting fares, tourists photographing themselves in front of restaurant marquees, couples debating which bar to try next, normal people with normal lives, none of them aware that 10 feet away, a woman was calculating revenge. Because that's what this was becoming. Not anger. Anger was heat and noise and immediate reaction. This was something colder. Christopher had revealed something tonight beyond casual cruelty. He'd shown her that he perceived her as fundamentally less than human, not just unimportant but unworthy of even basic camouflage in his insults. He'd assumed absolute ignorance, absolute safety in his contempt. That assumption was data. And data could be weaponized. Vanessa finally tapped the Uber app, but her mind was already working through different calculations now. She wasn't thinking about tomorrow's presentations or calendar management. She was thinking about the term sheet Christopher had negotiated so aggressively tonight, the liquidation preference structure, the milestone triggers, the governance provisions that would shift control if performance faltered. She was thinking about the quarterly retention metrics that Gerald had mentioned, the ones showing early signs of trouble. The customer acquisition costs climbing, while lifetime value projections softened. She was thinking about all the emails she'd drafted, all the financial models she'd reviewed, all the board decks she'd formatted in 14 months of being furniture. And she was thinking about the fact that furniture heard everything. Vanessa's apartment in Astoria occupied the 3rd floor of a pre-war building, whose owners hadn't bothered with cosmetic renovations since approximately 1987. The radiators clanked like imprisoned ghosts, the kitchen linoleum had curled at the corners, and the bathroom tile grouted in institutional beige suggested a hospital more than a home. But the rent was stabilized at $2,000 a month, vanishingly rare in New York, and the location allowed her to reach Midtown in 35 minutes, door to door, which meant she could maintain the fiction of work-life separation. She arrived home at 11:40, dropped her portfolio on the dining table she'd bought from a sidewalk estate sale, and immediately opened her laptop. The apartment's one luxury was internet, gigabit fiber she'd paid to have installed herself, routing through a VPN that cycled through 3 different countries before connecting to any external server. Paranoid, perhaps. But she'd worked in big law long enough to understand that information security wasn't paranoia. It was insurance. She made chamomile tea in the one proper mug she owned, a piece of Swiss pottery her mother had brought back during their final year in Geneva, white porcelain with a simple blue alpine flower pattern, and settled into her desk chair. Then she began the inventory. 14 months of emails. Every message Christopher had ever sent from his executive account automatically CC'd her for awareness and filing. Every board report, every investor update, every internal financial analysis. She'd organized them meticulously in a folder structure that made retrieval instantaneous. Now she started reading them differently, not as an assistant ensuring her boss had the information he needed. As an analyst, searching for structural weakness. The company was called Covenant Properties, which Christopher insisted everyone pronounce with reverence, capital letters audible. The business model was straightforward in concept, a digital platform that allowed residential real estate investors to buy and sell fractional shares of rental properties the way they'd trade stocks. I want exposure to Brooklyn brownstones but only have $50,000 to invest? Covenant would let you buy exactly 3.2% of a specific property, collect your proportional rent, and sell your fraction whenever you wanted liquidity. The appeal was obvious. Real estate was the largest asset class most Americans never actually owned beyond their primary residence. Institutional investors and wealthy individuals controlled the rental market, capturing both rental yield and property appreciation. Covenant promised to democratize that access, creating liquidity in an illiquid market. The execution was more complicated. Vanessa pulled up the Series A investment memo, the one Christopher's team had used to raise $85 million 18 months earlier. So the projections had been intoxicating. 10,000 properties on the platform within 3 years, $15 billion in transaction volume, a clear path to profitability by year 5. The pitch deck had positioned Covenant as the Robin Hood of real estate, making investing accessible, eliminating traditional gatekeepers, empowering regular people to build wealth. The reality, buried in the weekly operational metrics that Vanessa compiled every Monday morning, told a more complicated story. Property acquisition was the first bottleneck. Covenant didn't actually own the real estate. That would require billions in capital. Instead, they partnered with existing landlords and property management companies, convincing them to list their buildings on the platform and allow fractional investment. This required extensive legal work, restructuring ownership into special purpose vehicles, drafting operating agreements that governed investor rights, ensuring compliance with securities regulations in every state. The legal costs alone were brutal. Vanessa found the invoice history from the 3 law firms Covenant kept on retainer: Skadden for securities work, Fried Frank for real estate structuring, a boutique firm in Delaware for corporate governance. Last quarter's combined legal spend, $4.7 million. Then there was the technology. Building a platform that could handle real-time trading of fractional real estate interests wasn't like building a shopping app. Every transaction triggered a cascade of legal documentation, transfer agreements, amended operating agreements, updated cap tables. The engineering team, with 67 people drawing San Francisco salaries in a Manhattan office, had been promising a full automation solution for 11 months. Current status: manual processing still required for 70% of transactions, which meant Covenant employed a back-office operations team of 43 people who manually reviewed and processed trades. At an average loaded cost of $95,000 per employee, that operations team burned through $4 million annually. Vanessa opened a new spreadsheet and started building a model. Revenue sources, transaction fees, monthly platform fees from investors, property management fees from landlords. She pulled the actual numbers from the Q3 preliminary results Gerald had mentioned. Monthly recurring revenue from platform fees, $2.1 million. Annual run rate, $25 million. Now, Christopher had claimed $17 million in revenue during the pitch, which meant he'd been annualizing 1 quarter's performance. Standard startup exaggeration, technically defensible if misleading. Transaction fee revenue was more volatile. Covenant charged 28 basis points on every trade, split between buyer and seller. In a good month with high trading volume, that generated another $1 million. In slower months, half that. She tabbed over to expenses. This was where the story fell apart. Engineering, $1.1 million monthly. Operations, $400,000 monthly. Sales and marketing, $2.8 million monthly. because acquiring both property listings and investor users required aggressive spending. General and administrative, Christopher's category, covering his salary, the executive team, are the Tribeca office with its Herman Miller furniture and Italian espresso machine. 900,000 monthly. Legal and compliance, averaging 400,000 monthly, with peaks when new properties came online. Total monthly burn rate, $6.2 million. Total monthly revenue, $3 million. The company was losing $3 million every month. At that rate, the $85 million Series A would be exhausted in less than 2 years, which was exactly why Christopher was desperately trying to close a Series B. But the deeper problem, the one Gerald had identified, was that the unit economics weren't improving. Customer acquisition cost for a new investor user, approximately $460, including all marketing and sales expense allocated per new sign-up. Our lifetime value of that customer, Covenant's internal projections estimated $1,500 over 3 years, assuming the customer maintained an active account and traded regularly. That was a reasonable multiple. 3x return on acquisition cost, if the assumptions held. But Vanessa pulled up the cohort retention analysis Christopher had dismissed so quickly during dinner. Users who signed up 6 months ago, 42% still active. Users who signed up 12 months ago, 28% still active. The retention curve was falling off faster than projected, which meant the actual lifetime value was likely closer to $900, meaning Covenant was paying $460 to acquire customers worth $900, a 2x return that barely covered the cost of capital, and certainly didn't justify a $450 million valuation. She leaned back in her chair, sipping her tea, watching the numbers coalesce into narrative. Christopher needed the Series B desperately, not because the business was thriving, but because the business was dying. He had perhaps 10 months of runway left. Without new capital, he'd have to either cut burn rate drastically, laying off half the team, abandoning the growth story, or shut down entirely. The term sheet he'd presented tonight reflected that desperation, even though he'd packaged it as founder confidence. The aggressive liquidation preference, the anti-dilution protection, the milestone triggers that would hand control to investors if targets were missed, those weren't standard terms. They were terms a founder accepted when he had no other options. And if Silver Lake and Deutsche passed, Christopher's options were narrowing rapidly. Vanessa opened her personal email, a Proton Mail account she'd set up years ago, end-to-end encrypted, and started drafting a message to herself. Not because she needed the reminder, but because the act of writing clarified thought. Christopher is vulnerable. The business is burning cash, retention metrics are deteriorating, and he's running out of investors willing to meet his terms. He needs the Series B to close in the next 90 days, or he faces a down round or shutdown. The question is, how can this vulnerability be exploited? She stared at the words, then deleted them. Too direct, too obvious. Even encrypted email left metadata, better to keep the analysis in her head. Her phone buzzed. A text from Christopher sent at 12:47 a.m. I need the market sizing analysis for tomorrow's presentation, the one showing TAM expansion into commercial real estate. Make sure the graphics are polished. No, please. No acknowledgement that it was almost 1 a.m. Just the assumption that she'd be awake, available, ready to serve. Vanessa opened her work laptop. She maintained 2 machines, keeping personal and professional strictly segregated, and found the analysis in her files. The market sizing presentation claimed that Covenant could expand from residential real estate into commercial properties, unlocking a $12 trillion addressable market. The analysis was technically accurate, but strategically irrelevant, since Covenant hadn't successfully built the residential business yet. But Christopher wanted polished graphics, so she'd give him polished graphics. She spent 90 minutes rebuilding the presentation: new color palette, cleaner typography, animated slide transitions that would dazzle without distracting. She pulled high-resolution images of commercial properties: office towers in Hudson Yards, retail spaces in Soho, industrial warehouses in Red Hook, and integrated them into the slides with subtle parallax effects. By 2:30, the presentation was flawless. She emailed it to Christopher with the subject line, "Market Analysis, Revised, and no body text." He didn't need pleasantries. He needed ammunition for his pitch. She closed the work laptop and returned to her personal machine. The revenge fantasy was seductive. Leak the troubling retention metrics to a journalist. Watch the company implode. See Christopher's arrogance collapse into professional ruin. But that was crude, unsatisfying, ultimately ineffective. Christopher would deny the data, blame disgruntled employees, probably survive the scandal if he managed to spin the narrative correctly. No, what Vanessa needed was leverage. Real leverage. The kind that gave her control over outcomes rather than simply damaging Christopher's reputation. She thought about the meeting tonight. Gerald and Wilhelm had been skeptical, but not entirely opposed. The business model intrigued them. The execution concerned them. If the retention metrics could be improved, if the unit economics could be tightened, if Christopher could be removed from operational control and replaced with professional management, then Silver Lake and Deutsche might still invest. They'd want new terms, less founder control, more investor protection, but the capital could still flow. And if Vanessa positioned herself correctly, she could be the one who facilitated that flow. The idea crystallized slowly, like frost forming on window glass. She couldn't attack Christopher directly, but she could make herself indispensable to the investors who were evaluating him. She could become the source of truth, the person who understood the business better than the founder himself. She could become the alternative. Vanessa opened a new browser window and navigated to LinkedIn. Found Gerald Feng's profile, Stanford MBA, 12 years at Silver Lake, focused on financial technology and marketplace businesses. 240 connections carefully curated. He didn't post frequently, but when he did, the content was substantive. Analysis of market trends, thoughtful commentary on regulatory changes affecting venture capital. She drafted a connection request. "Gerald, thank you for the engaging discussion at Le Bernardin tonight. I've had the opportunity to work closely on Covenant's operational metrics and would welcome the chance to share additional context on the retention analysis if useful for your diligence process. Best, Vanessa Hartford." She hovered over the send button, then paused. Too eager. Too obvious. Gerald would wonder why Christopher's assistant was reaching out directly, would suspect insubordination, or worse. She deleted the draft. Better to wait. Better to let the deal deteriorate further. Let Christopher grow more desperate. Let the pressure build until the opportunity for intervention presented itself naturally. Patience was leverage too. She finished her tea, shut down both laptops, and went to bed. Tomorrow would be 7 a.m. arrival. I's 14-hour day, Christopher's mounting frustration as more investors declined meetings or failed to return calls. She'd need to be rested, focused, ready to maintain the performance of invisible competence. But now she was performing with a different objective. Not to serve Christopher's ambitions, but to document their failure. Every email she filed was potential evidence. Every financial analysis she prepared was ammunition for future negotiations. Every board meeting she attended silently was an intelligence-gathering operation. Cet idiot sans éducation was building a file. And when the moment came, she'd be ready to deploy it. The Morgan Stanley Technology Summit occupied 3 floors of their Times Square headquarters, 2,000 investors and entrepreneurs packed into conference rooms and networking lounges. Makes every conversation a potential transaction. Christopher worked the crowd with practiced enthusiasm, his pitch refined to elevator length. We're building the infrastructure that makes real estate liquid. Think about it. The largest asset class in America, completely illiquid. We're changing that. Vanessa stood 8 feet behind him, tablet ready, tracking which conversations lasted longer than polite dismissal. She'd learned to read investor interest through body language. Genuine curiosity produced forward leans and follow-up questions. Polite disinterest generated backward angles and glances toward exits. Most conversations tonight produced backward angles. By 6 p.m., Christopher had collected 17 business cards and 0 commitments for follow-up meetings. His smile had grown rigid, his handshake slightly too forceful. Vanessa watched him drain his second whiskey at the networking reception, watched him scan the room for bigger targets, watched the desperation start showing through the performance. "There," he muttered, nodding toward a cluster near the windows. "That's Rebecca Thornton from Andreessen. Get me an introduction." Vanessa had no connection to Rebecca Thornton and no legitimate path to introduction, but Christopher wasn't asking for legitimate paths. He was asking for results. She approached a conference organizer she'd spoken with earlier, a harried woman in her 30s juggling 3 phones, and mentioned that Mr. Aldridge was hoping to connect with Miss Thornton regarding a potential Series B that might be of interest. The organizer, grateful for any interaction that didn't involve logistical emergencies, made the introduction. Christopher deployed his pitch. Rebecca Thornton listened with the particular expression venture capitalists developed after hearing 10,000 pitches, attentive but fundamentally unmoved. After 6 minutes, she thanked Christopher for his time and mentioned that Andreessen's current fund was fully deployed in prop tech, but he should definitely stay in touch. Venture capital rejection translated, "Your deal isn't interesting enough to merit our attention." In the Maybach heading to Cipriani for the Alzheimer's benefit, Christopher's facade finally cracked. 18 months ago they were fighting for allocation, he said, staring through the window at the gridlocked traffic on 42nd Street. Every major fund wanted in. Now suddenly everyone's fully deployed, or taking a pause on new investments, or concerned about the macro environment. It's all bullshit. Vanessa said nothing. She'd learned that Christopher's rhetorical questions didn't require answers. They required audiences. The business is solid. The metrics are strong. We're executing exactly according to plan. But the narrative has shifted, and now everyone's looking for reasons to pass. He turned toward her, seeing her perhaps for the first time all day. What am I missing? What's the disconnect? It was the first time in 14 months he'd asked her opinion on strategy rather than logistics. Vanessa considered her response carefully. "The retention numbers," she said quietly. Gerald raised concerns about cohort performance. If investors believe users are churning faster than projected, the lifetime value assumptions collapse. That undermines the entire growth thesis. Christopher waved this away. The retention numbers are fine. One bad quarter doesn't negate the trend. Investors are just being irrationally risk-averse. Perhaps, but perception drives valuation. If Silver Lake shared their concerns with other funds, that could explain the cooling interest. Then we need to fix the perception. What's our retention rate for the most recent cohort? Vanessa pulled up the data on her tablet. Users who signed up in September are showing 48% activity after 30 days. That's up from 42% for the August cohort. There. See? The trend is improving. We need to lead with that data. Rebuild the pitch deck to emphasize the inflection point in retention. Show that we've solved the engagement problem. Except they hadn't solved the engagement problem. The September improvement was statistical noise, a single data point that could easily revert in October. But Christopher wanted ammunition, not accuracy. "I'll revise the deck tonight," Vanessa said. They arrived at Cipriani. The gala was the kind of event where Wall Street performed charity. $2,000 per plate, silent auction items starting at $50,000, everyone dressed in formal wear that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Christopher's wife, Diane, met them at the entrance, her Valentino gown and Van Cleef jewelry suggesting she'd spent her afternoon preparing for precisely this kind of visibility. "You're late," Diane said, kissing Christopher's cheek without enthusiasm. The Silvermans are already asking about the foundation donation. Tell them the wire is processing." Christopher accepted champagne from a passing waiter, drained it in 3 swallows, took another. "I need to work the room. Vanessa, stay close. There are people here I need to connect with." Diane's eyes flicked toward Vanessa with the particular expression that wealthy wives developed when assessing their husband's assistants. Evaluating threat potential. Vanessa had learned to defuse this with careful invisibility. Perfect posture, professional distance, zero eye contact with Christopher that could be interpreted as familiarity. "Of course," Vanessa said, stepping back 2 feet to establish proper spatial hierarchy. The ballroom glittered with baccarat crystal chandeliers and arrangements of white roses that probably cost more than Vanessa's monthly rent. 800 guests circulated through the cocktail reception, their conversations a symphony of wealth performing consciousness. Foundation boards and philanthropic initiatives and impact investing. Every sentence crafted to signal virtue while maintaining hierarchy. Christopher navigated the room with renewed energy, the alcohol smoothing his desperation into confidence. He worked clusters of financiers and tech executives, deploying his pitch with variations calibrated to each audience. So to the private equity guys, "We're fundamentally solving the liquidity problem in alternative assets." To the tech founders, "We're building the financial infrastructure for the next generation of investors." Vanessa tracked his progress while maintaining her invisible position at the periphery. She noticed patterns. Christopher targeted men exclusively, rarely approaching mixed groups or women alone. He interrupted conversations rather than waiting for natural openings. He touched people's arms and shoulders with the presumption of familiarity that successful people mistook for charisma. At the table during dinner, Vanessa was assigned to the auxiliary seating near the kitchen, staff overflow. She watched Christopher drink through the first 3 courses. Watched him lean too close to the woman seated at his right, then a hedge fund manager named Patricia something or other, whose body language suggested polite tolerance rather than interest. Watched Diane maintain her fixed smile while speaking to the man on her left, performing the role of supportive spouse with professional precision. Between courses, Vanessa's phone buzzed. Email from an address she didn't recognize, roland.pritchard@silverlakecap.com. Subject line: Operational diligence, confidential inquiry. Her pulse accelerated. She opened the email. "Ms. Hartford, Gerald Feng mentioned you've been instrumental in preparing the operational metrics and financial analyses for Covenant Properties. We're continuing our evaluation of the potential investment and would benefit from some additional context on the retention data and unit economics. Would you be available for a brief call this week to discuss? This inquiry is part of our standard diligence process. Best, Roland Pritchard, Principal, Silver Lake Capital." Vanessa read the message 3 times, parsing every word for subtext. This was unusual. Not unheard of, but unusual. Sophisticated investors sometimes contacted operational staff during diligence to verify the information founders provided. But typically those conversations were formally arranged, with the founders' knowledge and consent. This email felt different. Confidential inquiry. "Would you be available?" The language suggested discretion, maybe even secrecy. She drafted 3 different responses before settling on the most neutral. "Mr. Pritchard, I'd be happy to help with any diligence questions. I'm available Thursday afternoon or Friday morning if either works for your schedule. Please let me know what areas you'd like to focus on so I can prepare relevant materials. Best, Vanessa Hartford. She hit send before she could second-guess herself. The dinner continued. Christopher's speech patterns were growing looser, his laughter slightly too loud. During the silent auction, he bid $75,000 on a week at someone's Turks and Caicos compound, got into a bidding war with a man Vanessa vaguely recognized from the Forbes 400, eventually won at $98,000. The ballroom applauded his generosity. Diane's smile never wavered. After midnight, in the Maybach heading home, Christopher's performance finally collapsed entirely. $98,000 for a vacation house I'll never use. But I had to win. I had to show I belong in rooms like that. He was slumped against the leather upholstery, tie loosened, the evening's alcohol catching up with his cognition. You know what the difference is between me and them? They inherited their capital. I built mine. But somehow that makes me lesser. Somehow that means I have to prove myself at every opportunity. Vanessa said nothing. Dimitri drove through empty Manhattan streets, the city's midnight silence amplifying the sound of the engine. I'm 43 years old, Christopher continued, apparently talking to himself now rather than her. I've built 3 successful companies. I've created hundreds of jobs. I've generated real returns for investors. But I'm still the guy from Tennessee who started with tire shops. That's all they see. The vulnerability was almost painful to witness. Vanessa found herself momentarily sympathetic. Not to Christopher's arrogance or cruelty, but to the fundamental insecurity driving it. The desperate need to be accepted by people who'd never accept him, because acceptance wasn't something wealth could purchase from those who'd always had it. Then she remembered. Cet idiot sans éducation. And the sympathy evaporated. Should I schedule a call with the marketing team to discuss the awareness campaign? She asked, her tone carefully professional. Christopher didn't respond. He'd fallen asleep, head tilted against the window, mouth slightly open. The Maybach pulled up to his Tribeca building. Dimitri met Vanessa's eyes in the rearview mirror with an expression of weary solidarity. They were both servants to wealth, both required to maintain dignity while witnessing its undignified reality. I can assist Mr. Aldridge to his residence, Dimitri offered. Thank you. Vanessa watched them disappear into the building's lobby, Christopher being gently guided toward the elevator by his driver. Then she gave Dimitri her Astoria address and sat alone in the back seat for the 30-minute drive home, her phone resting in her palm, Roland Pritchard's email glowing on the screen. She had 48 hours to decide how much truth to share with Silver Lake Capital. Thursday afternoon arrived with the particular clarity that October sometimes granted New York. Sharp light, crisp air, the city momentarily free from its usual haze of humidity and pollution. Vanessa took the call from her apartment, ensuring Christopher was occupied in a board meeting she'd scheduled deliberately to create a 3-hour window of privacy. Roland Pritchard's video appeared on her laptop screen. Early 30s, Harvard Business School class ring visible when he gestured, the studied casualness of expensive business wear trying to appear unstudied. Vanessa, thanks for making time. He'd opened, his tone calibrated between professional formality and conspiratorial friendliness. I'll be direct. Gerald came away from the dinner meeting with concerns about Covenant's retention metrics. Christopher was adamant the issues were temporary, but we'd like to understand the underlying data more completely. You've been preparing the operational reports, correct? That's right. I compile the weekly metrics from the engineering and operations teams, format them for board distribution, and maintain the historical database. So you'd have visibility into the cohort performance over time. Complete visibility. Roland leaned back in his chair. Behind him, Bookshelves displayed the particular collection that ambitious venture capital professionals curated: copies of 0 to 1, The Lean Startup, various business biographies arranged by spine color for aesthetic rather than intellectual coherence. What we're trying to understand, Roland continued, is whether the retention deterioration is a temporary blip or a structural problem with the product. Christopher claims the September cohort showed improvement. The data you sent in advance of this call suggests otherwise. Vanessa had prepared carefully. Not lying. Lying would be discovered immediately during full diligence. But framing. Presenting the data with context that Christopher consistently ignored. The September cohort did show 48% 30-day retention, which is higher than August's 42%, she said, pulling up the spreadsheet she'd prepared. But if you segment by user acquisition source, the improvement is entirely attributed to a partnership campaign with a personal finance influencer who drove higher intent traffic. Users acquired through the standard paid marketing channels showed continued decline. September was actually worse than August, 37% versus 42%. Roland's expression shifted. So the improvement was cherry-picking high-quality users from a non-scalable source. Correct. The influencer partnership generated about 4,000 sign-ups. But that channel can't be reliably replicated at scale. The core acquisition engine is still showing deterioration. Why would Christopher present this as evidence of inflection? Vanessa chose her words with surgical precision. I think there's genuine belief that the product improvements will eventually drive better retention. The engineering team has been working on engagement features, push notifications, personalized property recommendations, social elements. In Christopher's mental model, user retention improves once those features ship. The September data confirms his hypothesis that better users equal better retention. But better users aren't the solution if you can't acquire them efficiently. No. Roland made notes on a legal pad, the scratch of his pen audible through the connection. Talk to me about unit economics. What's the true customer acquisition cost? Vanessa pulled up her detailed analysis. It depends on how you calculate. Christopher uses a simple model. Total sales and marketing spend divided by new user acquisitions. That yields approximately $460 per user. But that doesn't account for the operations team required to process transactions or the customer support team required to handle user questions. If you load those costs into the CAC calculation, you're closer to $650 per user. And lifetime value? Covenant's model assumes $1,500 over 3 years, based on platform fees and transaction revenue. That assumes users maintain active accounts and trade frequently. The actual data suggests average lifetime value is running closer to $800 and declining as retention worsens. Roland stopped writing. So, you're acquiring users at $650 who generate $800 in lifetime value. That's a 1.2x return. Correct. That's not a venture-backable business. That's barely break-even after accounting for cost of capital. I know. The silence stretched between them. Vanessa could see Roland processing the implications. Christopher had presented Covenant as a high-growth technology company with strong unit economics, but the reality was a business model that barely worked even in optimistic scenarios. Why are you telling me this? Roland asked finally, his tone shifting from analytical to personal. Christopher is your boss. Sharing this information is relevant to your diligence process, Vanessa interrupted. You asked for accurate data. I'm providing it. But you must know this information substantially undermines the investment thesis. Yes. So why share it? Vanessa had prepared for this question, had scripted various responses ranging from whistleblower ethics to personal conscience. But sitting in her Astoria apartment, looking at Roland's carefully neutral expression, she made a different calculation. She told the truth. Christopher humiliated me at the Le Bernardin dinner, she said quietly. He ordered in French specifically to insult me, assuming I wouldn't understand. Called me an uneducated idiot. He was showing off for you and Gerald, demonstrating his sophistication by using me as the punchline. Roland's face registered surprise, then something darker. I remember him ordering in French. I didn't realize. What specifically did he say? Apportez-moi quelque chose de décent, pas la piquette que cet idiote sans éducation boirait. Bring me something decent, not the swill this uneducated idiot would drink. But you speak French? Fluently. I spent 7 years in Geneva as a child. Roland exhaled slowly, and he had no idea. None. I'm furniture to him. He doesn't know anything about me beyond my ability to manage his calendar and format his presentations. It never occurred to him I might be a complete person with a biography. That's appalling. It's revealing. If Christopher makes that assumption about me, someone who manages his most sensitive business information, what other assumptions is he making about users, about partners, about the market? His pitch is built on confidence in his own judgment. But his judgment is fundamentally compromised by arrogance and blind spots. Roland was quiet for a long moment. Then, what outcome are you hoping for from this conversation? Vanessa had reached the critical juncture. She could maintain plausible deniability, claim she was simply answering questions honestly, that she hadn't intended to undermine Christopher's fundraise, or she could leverage this moment into something more valuable. She chose leverage. I'm hoping Silver Lake recognizes that Covenant's technology and market position have genuine value, but the current management is executing poorly. The business could be successful with operational discipline and realistic growth expectations. But Christopher will never provide that discipline. He's too committed to the performance of being a visionary founder. You're suggesting we invest but replace Christopher. I'm suggesting that if you invest, you should have terms that give you meaningful operational control. Milestone triggers that shift board seats. Hiring authority over key executives. The ability to bring in professional management if the business fails to hit realistic targets. That's a governance structure Christopher would never accept. He will if he's desperate enough. The Series B needs to close in the next 90 days, or Covenant runs out of cash. His options are narrowing. If you present terms that give you control but still allow him to save face, advisory role, chairman title, equity retention, he might accept rather than face shutdown. Roland leaned forward. And what role do you see yourself playing in this structure? That depends on what Silver Lake needs. I know this business better than anyone except the engineering team. I've prepared every board presentation, compiled every operational report, sat in every strategic planning meeting. If you want someone who can actually execute on the business plan Christopher pitches, I'm that person. You want his job. I want a job that recognizes my capabilities. Whether that's at Covenant or elsewhere is negotiable. But yes, I'm significantly more qualified to run operational execution than Christopher is. Roland sat back, processing. Vanessa watched him calculate the angles, the ethical questions of accepting information from a disgruntled employee, the strategic opportunity of gaining inside intelligence on a struggling investment target, the risk of relying on someone with obvious personal motivations. I need to discuss this with Gerald and the partnership, he said finally. What you're describing is a potential investment opportunity, but it's also potentially actionable information about management dysfunction. We need to be careful about how we proceed. I understand. Can I share this conversation with Gerald? Not for attribution, but as context for our diligence conclusions. Yes. And you're prepared for the possibility that we walk away entirely? That the information you've shared kills the deal rather than restructuring it? Vanessa had considered this. If Silver Lake passed, Christopher would struggle to find alternative investors. The company might fail. She'd be unemployed, but she'd also be free. I'm prepared, she said. Roland nodded slowly. "I'll be in touch within a week. In the meantime, please don't mention this conversation to Christopher or anyone else at Covenant. If we do pursue investment, the approach needs to be carefully choreographed." "Of course." The call ended. Vanessa closed her laptop and sat in the silence of her apartment, feeling the weight of what she'd just initiated. Not merely revenge, though that was certainly present, but something more complex. She'd positioned herself as a solution to a problem she'd helped define. She'd transformed from invisible assistant to strategic actor. The question was whether Silver Lake would recognize her value or simply use her information to negotiate better terms with Christopher, leaving her exposed and unemployed. She wouldn't know for a week. In the meantime, she had to maintain the performance. Had to show up tomorrow at 7 a.m., format Christopher's presentations, manage his calendar, remain invisible while cataloging every additional piece of evidence that might be useful when the endgame arrived. Her phone buzzed. Text from Christopher. "Board meeting ran long. Need you to push tomorrow's 9 a.m. with Sequoia to 10 a.m. Also pull together a comparison analysis of our retention metrics versus roof stock and fund rise. Their S1 filings should have the cohort data. I want to show we're outperforming category benchmarks," Vanessa replied immediately. "We'll adjust the calendar and have the analysis ready by morning." Then she opened her laptop and began researching roof stock and Fundrise's public filings. Not because Christopher deserved her best work, but because the quality of her analysis was building her own credibility. Every report she prepared was a demonstration of capability. Every insight she generated was ammunition for whatever came next. She worked until 2 a.m., producing a 30-slide comparison analysis that showed Covenant's retention metrics were actually middle of the pack for the category, neither catastrophic nor impressive. The data undermined Christopher's narrative but provided useful context for understanding competitive positioning. She emailed the deck to Christopher with a 2-sentence summary. No editorial commentary, no strategic recommendations, just the data cleanly presented. Then she went to bed, setting her alarm for 5:30 a.m., and dreamed of Geneva, of walking through the old city with her mother, speaking French without self-consciousness, and being seen as a complete person rather than expensive furniture. When she woke, she checked her email immediately. Nothing from Roland. Nothing from Gerald. Just the usual morning flood of messages from Christopher's executive account, copied to her for awareness and filing. She showered, dressed in her standard uniform of black theory suit and white silk blouse, made coffee in her ancient percolator, and began her commute to Midtown. The revenge was patient now. She'd planted seeds. The question was whether they'd germinate fast enough, or whether Christopher would somehow manage to close a Series B from a different source before the leverage she'd created could be deployed. She'd know soon enough. Her venture capital moved slowly until suddenly it moved all at once. Months of diligence followed by 48 hours of term sheet negotiation and wire transfers. Vanessa boarded the N train at Astoria Boulevard, found a seat near the door, and spent the 30-minute ride reviewing her calendar. Christopher had 7 meetings scheduled today, 3 of them investor pitches, all of them requiring her invisible presence and detailed preparation. She'd be perfect at all of them. That was the weapon she was building. Not sabotage. Anyone could sabotage. But demonstrating that she was the infrastructure holding Christopher's performance together and that infrastructure could be redirected toward better outcomes if someone with actual authority recognized its value. The train emerged from the tunnel into Queens' morning light. Vanessa watched the city assemble itself beyond the window, warehouses giving way to residential buildings, giving way to the Manhattan skyline, and felt something she hadn't felt in 14 months. Hope. Not for Christopher's success, but for the possibility of agency, for for the chance to transform from observer to actor, from furniture to architect. Cet idiot sans éducation was designing a building, and when it was complete, Christopher Aldridge would be living in a house she'd built. The call from Roland came 6 days later, during Christopher's lunch meeting with a family office from Dallas. Vanessa was stationed at a small table in the corner of the restaurant, reviewing documents while remaining available for immediate summons. Her phone lit up with Roland's name. She stepped outside to take it. "Vanessa, we need to talk," Roland said without preamble. "Can you meet me this evening? Not at our office, somewhere neutral." "When and where?" 7 p.m. The lobby bar at the Greenwich Hotel. "I'll be there." The call lasted 18 seconds. Vanessa returned to her corner table, her expression unchanged, but her mind calculating rapidly. The Greenwich Hotel was expensive and discreet, the kind of place where private equity professionals conducted sensitive conversations away from their own offices. Roland's tone had been carefully controlled but urgent. Something had shifted. The afternoon passed in Christopher's usual rhythm of performance and disappointment. The Dallas family office listened to his pitch with polite attention and declined to proceed. They were focused on established businesses with positive cash flow, are not early-stage growth companies. Christopher's frustration was visible only to people who'd learned to read his micro-expressions. The tightening around his eyes, the slightly too forceful handshake at departure, the silence in the Maybach afterward. "What's tomorrow's schedule?" he asked finally. 8 a.m. breakfast with the CFO and legal counsel to review the draft S1 for the potential IPO scenario. 10 a.m. you're presenting at the NASDAQ Entrepreneur Center. 2 p.m. open for calls and catch-up work. 6 p.m. you have the American Cancer Society benefit at the Four Seasons. Cancel the breakfast. I don't want to talk about IPO scenarios when we can't close a basic Series B. It's premature and it makes us look desperate. He rubbed his eyes. How many investor pitches have we done in the last 6 weeks? Vanessa didn't need to check her notes. 43. And how many have progressed to term sheet discussions? 0. Something is broken. Either the market has completely lost appetite for PropTech, or there's a narrative circulating that's poisoning the well. I need you to do some intelligence gathering. Reach out to your contacts at other startups. See if you can find out what investors are saying about us behind closed doors. Vanessa nodded, filing this request away. What Christopher didn't know was that she already had perfect intelligence about what investors were saying. She'd provided that intelligence herself. "I'll make some calls," she said. That evening, she arrived at the Greenwich Hotel at 6:45, early enough to compose herself, but not so early as to appear over-eager. The lobby bar was designed for discretion. Low lighting, sound-absorbing fabrics, seating arrangements that created natural privacy. Roland was already there, occupying a leather booth in the far corner, a glass of something amber in front of him. Vanessa slid into the booth across from him. A server materialized immediately, the kind of attentive service that came from training rather than hovering. "Just water, please," Vanessa said. The server departed. Roland looked at her directly, his expression serious. "We're going to make an offer on Covenant," he said. "But not the deal Christopher proposed. We're going to present terms that give Silver Lake and Deutsche majority board control, milestone-based management changes, and a substantially lower valuation. 200 million Series B at a 600 million post-money valuation, down from the 900 million Christopher was targeting. Vanessa did the math instantly. Christopher's ownership would be diluted significantly. He'd go from controlling the company to being a minority stakeholder accountable to investors. "He'll never accept those terms," she said. "He will if the alternative is running out of money in 8 weeks. Roland leaned forward. "We've done extensive modeling based on the data you provided. Christopher has enough runway to get through December, possibly into early January if he cuts burn rate. but he can't cut burn rate without destroying the growth story, which would make raising capital even harder. He's trapped. What happens to him in this structure? He remains CEO initially, but reports to a board with majority investor control. If he hits quarterly milestones, specifically around retention improvement and unit economics, he keeps the role. If he misses 2 consecutive quarters, the board has authority to replace him with professional management. We're also installing a new CFO immediately, someone with public company experience who can implement financial discipline. And you want me to do what exactly? Roland pulled out his tablet, brought up a document. We're offering you the chief of staff position. You'd report directly to the board, not to Christopher. Your mandate would be operational execution, ensuring the business hits the milestones we're setting, implementing the efficiency improvements we believe are possible, serving as the board's eyes and ears inside the company. Salary of $300,000 plus equity package that could be worth substantial value if we successfully turn this around. Vanessa absorbed this. Chief of staff was a real role with real authority. Not the C-suite, but close. More importantly, it was a position with board-level access and credibility. What's the timeline? We're presenting the term sheet to Christopher on Monday. We expect negotiation, pushback, possibly dramatic threats to walk away. But ultimately, we believe he'll accept because he has no viable alternatives. Once the term sheet is signed, we'll move quickly to close. Probably 30 days for full legal documentation and wire transfer. You'd start in the chief of staff role immediately upon closing. Christopher will view this as betrayal, Vanessa said. He'll know I was the source of the intelligence that shaped your offer. Almost certainly. Which is why we're offering you this position. You'll need it for both professional credibility and legal protection. As chief of staff reporting to the board, you're not Christopher's employee anymore. You're the board's representative. He can't retaliate without board approval. Vanessa sat back, processing. This was more than she'd anticipated. Not just revenge, but genuine career acceleration. From invisible assistant to strategic executive in a single leap, but it required accepting that she'd burned the bridge with Christopher completely. He'd never forgive this. Even if he remained CEO, even if he somehow accepted the new power structure, he'd view her as the architect of his humiliation. I need one assurance, she said. If Christopher is removed as CEO, I want consideration for the permanent operating role. Not immediately. I understand the board would want someone with CEO experience initially, but as a succession candidate within 2 years. Roland nodded slowly. That's reasonable. If you perform well as chief of staff, demonstrate you can actually run the operational machine, the board would absolutely consider you for the CEO role. I can't promise it. There are a lot of variables, but I can commit that you'd be a serious candidate. Then I accept. They shook hands across the table. The gesture felt formal, binding, irreversible. One more thing, Roland said. Between now and Monday, you need to maintain absolute normalcy. Christopher can't suspect anything is coming. If he gets wind that we're preparing a down-round offer with governance changes, he'll try to find alternative financing or take other defensive measures. Your job is to keep him focused on normal operations while we finalize the paperwork. Understood. Good. Roland finished his drink. This is going to get uncomfortable, Vanessa. Christopher built this company. However poorly he's managed it, he's still the founder. What we're doing is necessary to save the business, but it's going to feel brutal to him. Are you prepared for that? Vanessa thought about dinner at Le Bernardin. Thought about 14 months of invisible service. Thought about the casual cruelty of assuming she was too uneducated to understand a simple insult. I'm prepared, she said. They parted outside the hotel. Roland to his car service, Vanessa to the subway. She rode the N train back to Astoria in a kind of stunned clarity. The autumn evening visible through the elevated tracks. the city transforming from Manhattan's vertical density to Queens' human scale. She'd done it. She'd weaponized information into opportunity. She'd transformed from victim to architect. Now she just had to survive the next 5 days without revealing anything. The weekend passed slowly. Christopher didn't contact her. He rarely did on Saturdays and Sundays unless genuine emergencies emerged. Vanessa spent the time preparing herself psychologically for Monday. She drafted and discarded various speeches she might give to Christopher, various explanations or justifications for her actions. Finally, she settled on saying nothing unless directly confronted. Let the situation speak for itself. Monday morning arrived cold and overcast. Vanessa dressed with particular care. Her most professional suit, understated jewelry, hair pulled back in a style that suggested seriousness. She arrived at the office at 6:30, an hour before Christopher typically appeared. At 8:40, her phone buzzed. Text from Roland. Term sheet being delivered to Christopher's counsel now. Conference call scheduled for 10 a.m. with Christopher, his lawyers, and our team. You should be in the office, but not in the room. Vanessa replied, Understood. At 8:55, Christopher burst through the office doors, his expression thunderous. He went directly into his private office and slammed the door hard enough that the glass walls shuddered. Vanessa remained at her desk, continuing her work with studied calm. At 9:15, Christopher's office door opened. He stood in the doorway, eyes staring at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Not anger, but something colder. Betrayal mixed with calculation. Did you know, he said quietly, that Silver Lake just sent me a term sheet that values my company at 33% less than I was asking, gives them board control and includes provisions for replacing me if I miss arbitrary milestones? No, Vanessa said. It was technically true. She'd known the general structure, but not the specific terms. Did you speak with anyone at Silver Lake about Covenant's metrics or operations? This was the moment. She could lie, claim ignorance, try to maintain her position, or she could own what she'd done. Vanessa stood, facing him directly. Roland Pritchard contacted me as part of their diligence process. He asked questions about retention metrics and unit economics. I answered honestly. You gave them ammunition to lowball my valuation. I gave them accurate data. What they did with that data was their decision. Christopher's face cycled through emotions, rage, disbelief, calculation. You've been with me for 14 months. I've paid you well. I've given you access to everything, and you sabotaged the most important fundraise of my career. You called me an uneducated idiot, Vanessa said quietly. In French, at Le Bernardin. You assumed I wouldn't understand. Christopher blinked. What? Cet idiot sans éducation. You ordered wine and insulted me in the same sentence. You used me as entertainment for the investors you were trying to impress. You assumed I was too stupid to comprehend basic French. He stopped. She could see him remembering, the pieces connecting. You speak French. Fluently. I lived in Geneva for 7 years. But you never asked about my background because I'm furniture to you. I'm not a person with a biography or capabilities or dignity. I'm just the assistant who manages your schedule and makes you look competent. So this is revenge? You're destroying my company because your feelings were hurt? I'm not destroying your company. Silver Lake is offering you capital to continue operating. The terms are stricter because your performance hasn't justified the valuation you're demanding. Those are facts, not feelings. Christopher moved closer, his voice dropping to something dangerous. You betrayed me. You violated confidentiality. I could sue you for what? Answering questions accurately during an investor's diligence process. There's no legal violation in providing factual information. You might want to focus your energy on deciding whether to accept Silver Lake's offer rather than threatening your assistant." They stared at each other across 5 feet of office space. Vanessa could feel her pulse in her throat but kept her expression neutral, refusing to show fear. "Get out," Christopher said finally. "You're fired. Leave now." "You can't fire me. Watch me. I've already accepted a position as chief of staff reporting to Silver Lake's board, pending deal closure. If you fire me now, you're interfering with the investment process. I'd suggest you speak with your lawyers before taking any action." Christopher's expression showed genuine shock now. "Chief of staff? The board wants operational oversight during the transition. Now I'm providing that service." "You conniving—" He caught himself, breathing hard. "You planned this. You've been planning this for weeks. I've been documenting accurate information and making it available to people who asked for it. What they did with that information was their choice. I'll refuse the term sheet. I'll find other investors." "That's your right, but you have 8 weeks of runway left. Good luck finding an investor who'll meet your terms in 8 weeks when 43 other investors have already passed." The numbers hit him visibly. Vanessa watched him calculate, saw the moment he realized she was right. He was trapped between accepting terms that humiliated him or running out of money and shutting down. "You'll regret this," he said quietly. "I'll make sure everyone in this industry knows what you did. You'll never work in tech again." Perhaps boards will recognize that I saved a struggling company from its founder's incompetence. We'll find out. She picked up her bag. "The board call is at 10 a.m. You should probably prepare with your counsel rather than threatening me." She walked out of the office, through the reception area, into the elevator bay. Her hands didn't shake until she was alone in the descending elevator, adrenaline finally catching up with the confrontation. She'd done it. She'd stood in front of Christopher Aldridge and told him exactly what he was, exactly what she'd done, and exactly why it was justified. And she'd walked out with her dignity intact. The deal closed 31 days later. Christopher had negotiated minor improvements to the terms, slightly higher valuation, marginally looser milestone requirements, but the fundamental structure remained. Investor control, performance-based management contingencies, and Vanessa as chief of staff with direct board reporting authority. The day the wire transfer cleared, Silver Lake installed their new CFO, a woman named Catherine Reeves who'd taken 2 previous venture-backed companies public and had precisely 0 tolerance for founder mythology. Within her first week, she'd implemented expense approval processes, cut unnecessary vendor relationships, and reduced monthly burn rate by 18% without touching headcount. Vanessa's first board presentation came 2 weeks after the deal closed. She'd prepared for 72 hours straight, building a comprehensive operational assessment that identified 37 specific initiatives for improving unit economics and retention. The presentation was 90 slides, each one backed by data rather than aspiration. Gerald Fung, attending his first board meeting as majority stakeholder, listened without interruption for 90 minutes. When Vanessa finished, he leaned back in his chair. "This is the most honest operational assessment I've seen from a portfolio company in 5 years," he said. "Everything Christopher told us was possible is actually possible. But the timeline is twice as long and requires discipline he wasn't willing to implement. Can you execute this plan?" "Yes," Vanessa said simply. "Then you have our full support. What do you need?" She was ready for this question. Authority to reorganize the operations and customer success teams, budget for 3 additional analysts to improve our data infrastructure, and weekly check-ins with you or Roland to ensure board alignment on key decisions. Done. Anything else? Christopher needs to be managed carefully. He's still CEO, still visible to employees and investors. If he undermines the operational changes, the plan fails. We need to keep him focused on strategy and fundraising rather than day-to-day execution. Wilhelm Ostermann, who'd been quiet throughout the meeting, spoke up. That's a diplomatic way of saying we need to limit his operational authority. Yes. Christopher won't accept that gracefully. No, but it's necessary. The board discussion continued for another hour, I ultimately establishing a governance structure that left Christopher with CEO title and external-facing responsibilities while shifting operational control to Vanessa and Catherine. Christopher attended the final 30 minutes of the meeting, his presence perfunctory, his contributions minimal. He'd been neutered by the term sheet he'd signed, and everyone in the room knew it. After the meeting, Vanessa returned to her new office. Actual office now, not a desk outside Christopher's door, and found an email from Gerald. Vanessa, impressive presentation today. You've clearly thought deeply about how to fix this business. I want to be direct with you about something. Christopher's tenure as CEO is probably 6 months unless he radically changes his approach. The board has lost confidence in his operational judgment. When we replace him, I'd like you to consider the interim CEO role while we conduct a formal search. You're not ready for the permanent position yet. You need more external credibility and C-suite experience, but interim CEO would give you that opportunity. Think about it. Gerald Vanessa read the email 3 times. 6 months. She'd be running Covenant Properties in 6 months, even if only temporarily. The invisible assistant would become the visible leader. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm. Vanessa arrived at 7 a.m., attended standing meetings with Catherine and the department heads, reviewed operational metrics, made rapid decisions about resource allocation and priority. She cut the partnerships team by 40% after analysis showed their deals were generating low-quality users. She restructured the customer success organization to focus on high-value accounts rather than trying to serve everyone equally. She implemented a rigorous product prioritization process that killed vanity features in favor of retention-driving improvements. The results came quickly. December retention metrics showed 49% 30-day activity, up from September's 37%. Customer acquisition costs declined as the marketing team shifted from spray-and-pray digital advertising to targeted campaigns focused on qualified investors. Monthly revenue crossed $4 million for the first time. Christopher watched this transformation from increasing distance. He still did investor calls, still represented the company at conferences, still maintained the performance of leadership. But everyone knew the real decisions were happening in meetings he wasn't invited to. 3 months after the Series B closed, Christopher requested a meeting with Vanessa. They met in a conference room, neutral territory rather than his office, and he closed the door. I want to understand something, he said without preamble. Was any of this personal? Or was I just a stepping stone? Vanessa considered the question. Both, she said finally. What you said at Le Bernardin was cruel and revealing. It showed me that I'd been performing invisibility for someone who genuinely believed I was less than human. That created motivation. But the opportunity itself was structural. You'd built a promising business but couldn't execute. Someone needed to fix it. I positioned myself to be that someone. By betraying me to the investors. By providing accurate information to people making a major capital allocation decision. If you call that betrayal, every due diligence process is a betrayal. Christopher was quiet for a long moment. You know what the worst part is? You were right. About the retention, about the unit economics, about my blind spots. I built something real but couldn't scale it because I was too committed to being the visionary founder, and now you're fixing it, and I have to watch. You could help, Vanessa said. You still have equity. You still benefit if the company succeeds. The board hasn't removed you. You could lean into the role you're actually good at, which is external storytelling and capital strategy. While you run the actual company? Yes. He smiled without humor. At least you're honest about it. He stood to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, I am sorry. About the French. I was showing off and I used you as a prop. That was wrong. Thank you. Doesn't change anything, though. No. He left. Vanessa sat alone in the conference room, feeling the strange emptiness that came after achieving revenge. She'd won. She'd transformed from furniture to executive. She'd proven her capabilities and positioned herself for actual leadership. But the victory felt different than she'd imagined during those early days of anger and calculation. Not triumphant, but sobering. Christopher was a real person, however flawed, and she'd systematically dismantled his professional identity. That was justified, necessary even, but it wasn't joyful. The door opened. Catherine Reeves leaned in. Board call in 5 minutes. Gerald wants to discuss the Q1 forecast. Vanessa gathered her materials and headed to her office. The revenge had been completed. Now came the harder part. Actually building something sustainable from the wreckage she'd created. Christopher resigned as CEO in May, 7 months after the Series B closed. The resignation was presented as mutual. He'd focus on strategic advisory role while the board brought in experienced operational leadership. Everyone knew the truth. He'd been forced out after missing 3 consecutive quarters of retention milestones. The board named Vanessa interim CEO while conducting an external search. The announcement sent ripples through the tech industry. The 29-year-old former executive assistant was now running a $400 million venture-backed company. The press coverage was unk. Some outlets wrote admiringly about her rise, framing it as a Cinderella story about hidden talent finally recognized. Others were more skeptical, questioning whether she had sufficient experience, whether her ascent was really merit-based or the result of betraying her former boss. Vanessa ignored all of it. She had a company to run. Her first major decision was restructuring the engineering organization. The technology team had been building features based on Christopher's vision rather than user data. Vanessa killed 15 projects immediately, refocusing the entire engineering budget on 3 initiatives that directly addressed retention. Better property recommendation algorithms, streamlined transaction processing, and social features that let investors follow each other's portfolios. The cuts were brutal but necessary. Vanessa laid off 32 people in her first month, mostly engineers working on vanity projects. She absorbed the hatred that came with those decisions. Employees who'd believed they were building something transformative suddenly told their work was irrelevant, but the operational metrics vindicated her approach. Q2 retention hit 54%. Q3 reached 58%. The unit economics finally crossed into positive territory. Customer acquisition cost of $500, lifetime value of $1,300. Not spectacular, but sustainable. Revenue growth accelerated as retention improved. The platform crossed 10,000 active investors, processing transactions on 400 properties across 32 states. Covenant wasn't the revolutionary platform Christopher had envisioned. It would never disrupt the entire real estate industry, but it was a solid, growing business serving a real market need. The board's external CEO search proceeded slowly. They interviewed candidates throughout the summer, experienced executives from public companies, former founders who'd scaled businesses successfully, professional managers with operational expertise. Vanessa met with each one, knowing she was effectively interviewing her future boss. In September, Gerald requested a private meeting. They met at a coffee shop in Chelsea, away from the office. So Gerald's choice, suggesting he wanted informal conversation rather than formal board business. "The search isn't going well," he said after they'd ordered. "We've talked to 23 candidates. The ones with the right experience don't want the job. They're concerned about stepping into a situation where they're replacing a founder and working with a board that's already established a strong operational leader. The ones who want the job don't have the right experience." So, what's the solution? I'd like to offer you the permanent CEO role. Vanessa kept her expression neutral, but her pulse accelerated. I've been interim CEO for 4 months. That's not enough time to prove I can lead long term. Your track record proves it. You've stabilized the business, improved all key metrics, made difficult personnel decisions, honor and maintained board confidence. You've demonstrated exactly what we need in a CEO, operational discipline combined with strategic clarity. What about external credibility? I'm 29. I've never been a CEO before, and my entire executive experience is 9 months. Investors and partners will question whether I'm qualified. Some will, and you'll prove them wrong by delivering results. Vanessa, the board doesn't need a celebrity CEO with impressive credentials. We need someone who understands this specific business and can execute the operational plan. That's you. Vanessa sipped her coffee, buying time to think. This was what she'd maneuvered toward for months. Real authority, legitimate leadership, permanent position rather than interim placeholder. But accepting meant abandoning the safety of being underestimated. As interim CEO, the failure could be explained away. She was temporary, inexperienced, learning on the job. As permanent CEO, failure would be definitive. What's the compensation package? She asked. Base salary of $350. Equity package that vests over 4 years, structured to give you approximately 3% fully diluted ownership if you hit performance milestones. If we successfully raise a Series C at a good valuation, or achieve profitability and head toward IPO, your equity could be worth 20 to 30 million. Vanessa did the math. 3% of a company potentially worth $1 billion. Life-changing money, enough to erase every financial constraint she'd ever experienced. I want 2 provisions, she said. First, 12-month severance protection if the board decides to replace me. I'm taking career risk by accepting this role at my age. I need insurance. Second, board membership. If I'm CEO, I should have a seat. Gerald nodded. Both reasonable. I'll draft the term sheet. We can announce next week if you're ready. I'm ready. They shook hands. Vanessa walked back to the office through Manhattan afternoon crowds, anonymous among thousands of people pursuing their own ambitions and calculations. She felt the weight of what she'd just accepted. Not just a job, but an identity. She'd never be invisible again. The announcement dropped the following Tuesday. Vanessa Hartford appointed permanent CEO of Covenant Properties, reporting to a board led by Silver Lake Capital. The press coverage was substantial. Forbes ran a profile titled, "From Assistant to CEO, The Unlikely Rise of Vanessa Hartford." TechCrunch analyzed the leadership transition, noting that founder-to-outsider CEO changes typically signaled either distress or maturation, and Covenant appeared to be the latter. Christopher issued a gracious public statement congratulating Vanessa and expressing confidence in the company's future. Privately, he sent her a brief email. You won. Congratulations. I hope you build something lasting. See, Vanessa didn't reply. There was nothing left to say between them. Her first board meeting as permanent CEO came in October. She presented the Q3 results, 61% retention, $5.2 million in monthly revenue, positive unit economics, and outlined the plan for Q4 and beyond. Covenant would slow growth slightly to focus on operational efficiency, targeting profitability by Q4 of the following year. Once profitable, they'd consider either another funding round to accelerate expansion or maintaining sustainable growth toward an eventual IPO. The board approved the plan unanimously. After the meeting, Wilhelm Ostermann approached her. I underestimated you, he said simply. When Roland first suggested that Christopher's assistant might be capable of running operational execution, I thought it was ridiculous. I was wrong. You've exceeded every expectation. Thank you. Don't let it go to your head. You're 9 months into this job. The real test is years 2 and 3, when the initial improvements plateau and you have to find new sources of growth. That's when most CEOs fail. Noted. He smiled. Good. Stay paranoid, stay honest, and don't start believing your own mythology. Vanessa took the advice seriously. The danger now wasn't external. The business was stable, the board supportive, the metrics improving. The danger was internal, believing that her rapid ascent meant she was exceptional rather than lucky, that intelligence alone would sustain success, that the anger and calculation that had fueled her initial maneuvering could be replaced with genuine leadership. She built a routine designed to maintain perspective. Every morning at 6 a.m. before the office, she went to a small French bakery in Astoria, a place her mother had discovered during their brief visits to New York after Geneva. She ordered a café crème and a croissant, sat at a corner table and read. Not business books or industry analysis, but literature. Flaubert and Camus, the authors she'd loved as a child in Switzerland. The ritual reminded her that she was a complete person with a biography, not just an executive with a title. That her value wasn't reducible to quarterly earnings or board presentations. That intelligence and capability existed independent of recognition and authority. She'd started this journey as furniture, invisible and overlooked. She'd transformed into an architect, someone who could design and build rather than simply serve. But the final transformation, the one she was still working toward, was becoming fully human again. Not performing capability for others' validation, but possessing it authentically. 2 years after becoming CEO, Vanessa stood on the balcony of Covenant's new headquarters in Hudson Yards, watching the sunset paint Manhattan's skyline in shades of amber and rose. The company now employed 340 people, processed $2 billion annually in property transactions, served 42,000 active investors, and was 6 months away from filing their S-1 for initial public offering. The journey from Le Bernardin dinner to IPO prospectus had taken exactly 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days. She still thought about that evening sometimes. About Christopher's casual cruelty. About the French words that had contained such complete dismissal of her humanity. About the decision she'd made in that moment to stop performing invisibility and start building leverage. The revenge itself had been clean, almost elegant. She'd taken Christopher's vulnerability, his desperate need for capital, his operational incompetence, or his assumption that she was too ignorant to matter, and transformed it into her opportunity. She'd provided accurate information to investors who needed it, positioned herself as the solution to problems she'd helped define, and executed the operational plan Christopher had promised but never delivered. But the real victory wasn't Christopher's departure or her elevation. The real victory was that Covenant had actually become valuable. The company now generated positive cash flow, provided liquidity for thousands of investors who'd been locked out of real estate markets, and employed people who built their careers on work that mattered. She'd taken something broken and made it functional. That was leadership, and it was satisfying in ways that revenge had never been. Her phone buzzed. Text from Gerald. S1 draft looks excellent. Legal team has final comments, but we're on track for January filing. Board dinner next week to celebrate. Bring someone if you'd like. You've earned this moment. Vanessa smiled, typing a quick reply of thanks. She'd brought her father to the office last week, his first visit since the cancer had gone into remission. He'd walked through the headquarters slowly, his health still fragile, looking at everything with the particular pride parents felt when their children succeeded beyond expectation. Geneva paid off after all, he'd joked, referencing the childhood years in Switzerland that had seemed at the time like professional sacrifice rather than opportunity. It did, Vanessa had agreed. Because that French she'd learned as a child, the fluency Christopher had assumed she didn't possess, had been the trigger for everything that followed. Not the cause, But the catalyst, the moment when dismissal had crystallized into determination. She'd heard Christopher had started a new company, another prop tech venture focused on commercial real estate. He'd raised a modest seed round, kept his head down, apparently learned some humility from the Covenant experience. Vanessa wished him well, genuinely. He'd been a necessary antagonist, but antagonists didn't have to remain enemies once the story concluded. The sunset was fading now, Manhattan's lights emerging as the sky darkened. Vanessa finished her coffee. Excellent coffee, whole bean from a local roaster prepared by the office's professional-grade espresso machine, and returned inside. She had work to do. The S1 needed final review. The board presentation required updating with Q4 preliminary results. And she'd promised the engineering team she'd attend their sprint planning session tomorrow morning. But first, she opened her personal laptop and typed a brief email to herself. An annual ritual she'd started after becoming CEO, writing to document what she'd learned. Year 2 lessons. 1. Revenge is a launching platform, not a destination. The satisfaction comes from building something legitimate, not from someone else's failure. 2. Authority is earned through repeated demonstrations of competence, not granted because you deserve it. 3. Stay connected to who you were before success. The person who lived in Geneva and Astoria and survived by being invisible has wisdom the CEO needs. 4. Intelligence without humility is just arrogance in disguise. 5. The best victory is when everyone wins. Investors get returns, employees build careers, customers get value. Zero-sum thinking is lazy. She saved the email, closed her laptop, and headed home to Astoria. She'd moved to a better apartment after her CEO salary kicked in. Larger space, modern kitchen, windows that actually sealed against winter wind. But she'd stayed in the neighborhood, maintaining some continuity with the person she'd been before everything changed. The N train carried her through the evening rush, pressed between commuters returning from Manhattan offices to Queens homes. Anonymous again, temporarily. Tomorrow she'd return to being CEO Hartford, the woman who'd engineered one of tech's more remarkable leadership transitions. But tonight, she was just Vanessa, reading Camus on the subway, thinking in French occasionally, remembering that intelligence and capability existed independent of titles and recognition. Cet idiot sans éducation had built a company worth hundreds of millions, but more importantly, she'd built herself into someone who could build companies. And that was the real ending. Not punishment for Christopher's cruelty, but transformation of her own capabilities into something lasting and legitimate. The revenge had been perfect, but what came after was better. And so Vanessa's journey reminds us that the most powerful weapon isn't anger, it's competence documented with patience. May you always recognize that being underestimated is sometimes the greatest strategic advantage. May you have the wisdom to turn every insult into information, every dismissal into determination, and every moment of invisibility into an opportunity to observe, learn, and prepare. Remember, the person taking notes in the corner might be writing the next chapter of the story, and you might not be the hero in their version. Now here's my challenge to you. If Vanessa's transformation from invisible assistant to powerful CEO inspired you, if this story made you think differently about workplace dynamics and strategic patience, then prove it. Hit that like button, not just for the algorithm, but as a declaration that you believe competence and intelligence will always outlast arrogance and assumption. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories about underdogs who outmaneuvered the powerful, about quiet strategists who changed the game, about people who transformed dismissal into destiny. And here's the real challenge. Drop a comment telling me about a time you were underestimated and what you did about it. Did you prove them wrong? Are you still building your case? Are you planning your own strategic emergence? Your story might inspire someone else who's currently being treated like furniture. I read every single comment, and I want to hear about your journey from invisible to undeniable. This community is built on people who refuse to accept other people's limited vision of who they are. So join us. Like, subscribe, comment, and then go document your competence. Your moment is coming. Make sure you're ready when it arrives.